Alright, so your exposure is dictated by three things. First being your ISO, the other is going to be your aperture, and then the other is going to be your shutter speed. So ISO is basically how sensitive the film is. So if you see on here, every film canister will have a number. It's going to be usually 1 through 1600, and that's going to be the ISO. So with ISO, easiest way to remember is that the lower the number is, the less sensitive, and the higher it is the more sensitive. So if you were going to be taking photos indoors where there's less lighting, you would want to use a higher ISO. Obviously if you're going to be outdoors where it's sunny or you have a lot of light from stadiums or something, you're going to want a lower ISO. The film that I gave is at 400, and I find that 400 is a very roundabout average ISO that lets you kind of play between low light situations and high light situations, where there's a lot of sunlight, things like that. With your camera, you're going to have basically a ASA or ISO window. ASA was basically what ISO was called back when it was film. If you see a DIN, that's basically the ASA rating, but in the UK. But anyway, on your film camera you should have a window on the shutter speed dial, and it should already be set to 400 because that's what I was shooting it with. But if not, you just lift up on the shutter border, the dial border, and you can rotate it and set it. So once you set your ISO, you don't really have to mess with it ever again if you're going to continue shooting on that same ISO with all your film. The camera will automatically adjust for whatever ISO you set that on. Alright, so your aperture. You can think of your aperture basically like the pupil in your eye. So as you adjust it, the diaphragm will open and close. In fact, let me take this off so you can see it better. And of course, like the pupil, it controls the amount of light that comes in. There you go. You can see as I close, the diaphragm closes. As I open, the diaphragm opens. So the corresponding numbers, the lower your aperture is, so for example here it's at 1.7, the aperture is completely open. If I adjust it to a higher aperture, for example 16, you see that the diaphragm is closed very tight and you only have a small window of light coming through. So basically the aperture allows you to control how much light is coming in through the camera. And the reason that's important is not only for balancing your exposure, but also for controlling your depth of field. So just like with your pupil, as it opens and closes, it will focus or basically change the depth of field and how much focus is in that zone. So again here, let's see. So 16 aperture, it's also called an f-stop, so you might see it written like that, or just f within the corresponding number. So at f16, you're going to have a small aperture. So if you're shooting something that is bright, so let's say a landscape, you'll want to have a higher f-stop, which will allow less light in, therefore not overexposing your photo. Also, it has the largest depth of field, and you can think of depth of field as basically a zone. So if you're here, and let's say the closest that your camera will focus at that current f-stop is 3 feet. So anything closer than 3 feet is going to be blurry. And let's say the furthest that that zone covers is 20 feet. So anything past 20 feet will also be blurry. So everything within this will be in focus. And of course that changes with that aperture. So at an f16 or an f-stop 16, a lot of times on there it'll have the focus basically be to infinity. So that's why landscape artists and everything, they'll usually shoot on a high f-stop, because it allows for the greatest focus zone, so to speak. And then if you're shooting something super close, so let's say you're doing like macro photography, you want to lower that f-stop to something like 2 or 4 or something like that. The reason being is it will open up that pupil or that diaphragm and allow more light in, which you need if you're going to be taking something real close, because there's not a whole lot of ambient light directly on that object. And also what that'll do is it will make that zone, that depth of field, very small. So that way you can focus up close, but of course the caveat to that is that the closer you want to focus, the smaller that depth of field becomes, which means you have a higher chance of everything outside of that becoming blurry. So if I put my f-stop or my aperture at 2, let's say, that's going to make my depth of field basically within a couple feet. So if anything is beyond 2 feet or 3 feet, it's going to be very blurry. So that'll be important as you shoot on automatic, because the aperture is basically what you're going to be focused on, since the camera will already take care of your shutter speed. So basically, just to recap, large f-stop or large aperture, so 16, 32, whatever, it's going to be a very small pinpoint window, but it's going to be a large depth of field, large focus area. Small f-stop or small aperture, it's going to be a very large diaphragm, large pupil, lets in a lot of light, and then it's going to be a small depth of field. And then shutter speed, that's super simple. Basically controls how long that shutter stays open, which basically helps control, again, the amount of light that comes in. So I have the camera set at 500, so that's basically 5/100ths of a second. Very quick. And then if I lower it to 1, basically 1 second, should stay open longer. Alright, and then of course, you can do something in between, like a 30, and you'll see it's not as slow as 1 second, not as fast as 500. And then there's also a setting on here, it's marked with a B, that stands for bulb. Basically that will keep the shutter open for as long as you hold this button down. So if I opened it, I can basically just keep it open for as long as I hold it down. So the biggest thing that shutter speed will control outside of how long the light is hitting the film is blur, basically. So because there's going to be movement sometimes when you're taking your photo, little micro movements. The higher your shutter speed is, so on here the highest it goes is 1000, so that's 1/1000th of a second. It's very fast. So if you have a fast shutter speed, you're going to minimize the amount of blur that happens, because as that shutter stays open and it's allowing the light to come in and hit that film, it's exposing that film. So if you're moving while that light is hitting that film and exposing it, that's where you're going to get that blur. It's basically pulling the image across. At least that's how I think about it. So if you shoot at a slower speed, so let's say 1/8, it's going to be very hard to hold the camera steady, especially if you're freehanding it, and so you're going to have much more blur. So if you're shooting something fast, let's say, you're shooting a car that's driving by, or a plane, or someone sprinting, the higher your shutter speed, the less blur you're going to have around that subject, or of the subject themselves if you're holding still. But again, if you're shooting on automatic, the camera is going to already adjust for that shutter speed. So let's say you're shooting a photo and you've got your subject in view, you have it on automatic, you look through your viewfinder and you're going to see the shutter speed on the side of that viewfinder. You're going to have 1000, and you're going to have probably like 1, and you're going to have all these lights on the side. So it'll light up at whatever shutter speed that the camera is adjusted to automatically based on how much light is going through your lens. And so if you were to change your f-stop, you're going to see that light go up and down and bounce around. So it'll change the shutter speed based on how much light you are allowing through that lens through the f-stop. And so if you're shooting on automatic and you don't want to have a slow shutter, so let's say you're at an f-stop that's high, like an f16, the shutter is going to accommodate for that lack of light that's coming through. So it's very pinpoint pupil. It's not letting a lot of light through at f16. So the shutter, to accommodate and get a balanced exposure, it's going to want to let light in for longer, because you're not letting that much light in. So it needs to accommodate by increasing the amount of time that the light is hitting the film. So it'll lower it to a 1/8, let's say, shutter speed. Well, you don't really want that because it's going to make your photo really blurry. So the way you adjust for that is you change your f-stop to something lower, let's say an f8. Well, f8 lets in twice the amount of light that f16 was letting in. So the camera's going to see that and say, okay, so there's more light coming through, which means I don't need to have light on the film for as long, so it will adjust the shutter speed and become faster. Let's say it adjusts it to 1/25. Well, 1/25th of a second, or 1/25th of a second, is pretty in between shutter speed. If you were to look on your dial, it's usually the one that's in the middle. So here I have 1000, 500, 250, and 125. And then below that is 60, 30, 15, and 8. So basically 125 sits pretty well in the middle of your shutter speed, and that's usually what I like to shoot on because it's very balanced. You get a little motion blur if you really twist and move the camera, but otherwise it's fast enough that I can shoot handheld without a tripod and I don't get any motion blur. So that's something to kind of play around with, especially if you have your DSLR. You can shoot on aperture priority mode, which is the same thing as automatic for the film camera, and you can play around and see how the aperture correlates with the shutter speed. And again, with film, you really don't have to worry about ISO once you've already established the film that you're using, because the ISO is not going to change on that whole film reel. So basically you're just focusing purely on aperture and shutter speed.